Hello, I am on screen and I'm assuming that the attendees of the webinar can hear me. I am Gary Gerstle, the Paul Mellon Professor of American History at the University of Cambridge, and it is my pleasure and privilege to host this history faculty alumni webinar on this Friday evening, March 4th. I have a confession to make. I'm hosting this from Cambridge's rival, University of Oxford, but we know that our institution will, in the end, triumph. As a faculty, we are eager to maintain connections with former students, and in many cases, to reestablish connections with students with whom we have lost connection. One way to do that is to introduce alumni to some of the exciting research that current faculty are undertaking. Hence this series of alumni webinars, which we launched this year, are continuing this year, which we launched last year, are continuing this year, and we intend fully to carry this into next year and the years beyond as well. Before introducing our speaker this evening, I want to thank CUDAR. Some of you may know what CUDAR is, but let me spell it out for you. Cambridge University Development and Alumni Relations, for all the support they have given us. We are privileged to have as our speaker this evening, Dr. Robert Lee, known to us as Bobby Lee, who is Assistant Professor of History at Cambridge and a Fellow of Selwyn College. Bobby received his BA degree from Columbia University, his MA and PhD degrees from University of California at Berkeley. He was then appointed as a member of the Harvard Society of Fellows, a very precious appointment in the United States. His research subject is a big one. In a phrase, his subject is land in 19th century America. This was the century in which the United States expanded across the North American continent, 3,000 miles altogether. Land was this new nation's most precious resource. American history is full of accounts of wagon trains, wars, cowboys, conquest, John Wayne, and innumerable treaties made and broken with indigenous peoples. But one part of the story has been neglected. Who came to own all this land located across a 3,000-mile expanse? What was the true value of this land when taken from indigenous populations, both at the moment of acquisition and across the decades? How much wealth was built up from this massive land transfer? Until recently, it was not possible to answer these questions with any kind of precision. But state-of-the-art computer-assisted technology has now made those answers possible. Bobby Lee is a pioneering figure in this field, not quite like the pioneers of the 19th century, but we might say equally intrepid. He's going to give you a glimpse of his work today. That glimpse is called Land Grab University. It is the untold story of how the public universities in the United States, one of the nation's, long seen as one of the nation's greatest institutional accomplishments. It's the untold story of how these public universities benefited from the immense transfers of land taken from indigenous peoples and given by the federal government to these new and fledgling institutions. It was an incredible transfer, an incredibly valuable resource. Bobby has already published an investigative report in the United States. It has caused quite a stir in the media, and it has already been showered with 10 prizes from journalists and historians alike. You will soon see that Bobby is one of the most exciting young historians working today. We are privileged to have him in our ranks, and we are privileged to have him with us for an hour this evening to introduce you and me, all of us, to the work that he's doing. Bobby, so good to have you with us. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you to QDAR for organizing this event tonight. And thanks to all the participants, the intrepid group who has come out on a Friday night here to hear about some of the research that I'm doing. I'm grateful for all of you for being here. As Gary mentioned, the project that I'm going to talk about tonight is called land grab universities. Here on this slide, you see the picture from the article we put out. There's a website out. There is a database that's related to this project. And I'm going to talk about all of these components and what's happened since we published this report and put this project out into the world in 2020. Let's see here. So this is land grab universities. So in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signs the Morrill Act, creating a nationwide land grant university system in the United States. This act is going to distribute public domain land to either establish or to aid colleges across the United States. These are thriving universities today, places like the University of California, where I got my degree, Cornell University, the University of Minnesota, MIT, you name it, you'll find them among the bunch. There's 52 of these beneficiaries. And for a long time, the land grant university system in the United States was celebrated and remembered as a donation from the federal government. And the scholarship on land grant universities had seldom asked who paid for the grants that enabled these universities to have such good fortune to be launched with seed money of endowments built off the sale of land across the public domain of the United States. Not asking that question at land grant universities, where the land came from, what kind of funds it was able to produce, has become something of a national pastime in the United States. You'll see references to the Morrill Act, to land grant universities all over the media. Maybe most memorably in recent memory at the Biden inauguration, Vice President Harris celebrated how, quote, in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln saw a better future and built it with land grant colleges and the Transcontinental Railroad. But behind the myth of effortless prosperity, sort of manna from heaven that surrounds land grant universities, lies really a huge wealth transfer that was masked as a donation. The Morrill Act worked by turning land expropriated from tribal nations into endowments for higher education. In all, the act redistributed nearly 11 million acres. That's an area, for those of us on this side of the Atlantic, that's an area about the size of Denmark. And I just checked earlier, it's an area 25 times the size of Cambridgeshire, where I'm located. It's more than 1,000 times the size of the city of Cambridge. It's more than 15,000 times the size of the University of Cambridge itself. And it's about 1.3 million times the size of Selwyn College, where I'm sitting right now. So this is a huge area that's redistributed from Indigenous nations to fledgling land grant universities across the country. And this area, about the size of Denmark, is broken up into almost 80,000 parcels that are scattered across 24 Western states in the United States. Now, according to federal records, what we were able to discover through this investigation, this land came from about 250 different tribal nations. It was acquired by the United States through more than 160 land cessions. These are mostly coerced sales, but often completely uncompensated takings of land. The money raised from this land provided land-grant universities with the equivalent of about $500 million in today's money. And this is at a time when these colleges are not the mega universities that we have today. They are tiny, tiny institutions with tens, 20s, hundreds of students. And this was the seed money that enabled them to get off the ground, get started, and become the universities that we are today. So this investigation, Land Grab Universities, tracked how the Morrill Act turned Indigenous land into college endowments. We identified nearly every acre obtained and sold, every land seizure or treaty made with the land's Indigenous caretakers, and every dollar endowed with profits, these profits from dispossession. So that's the project that I'm going to be talking about today. And I'd like to start by giving you some background on the project and providing additional detail about the Morrill Act of 1862 and the approach that we took to investigating it. So the Indigenous sources of university land has been only an emerging issue, maybe in the last 5 or 6 years. And the source of historians starting to ask questions about the land that universities were able to develop to finance themselves came out of studies of slavery and the university, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. There's been these types of investigations at universities across the United States. There's currently one going on now at Cambridge. And these types of questions about the capitalization of universities within a broader colonial framework were a natural springboard for thinking about the land, the physical land that launched land-grant universities. So scholars sort of thinking about this question started small. In 2014, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, she published a book called An Indigenous People's History of the United States that flagged this issue really just in a sentence. Cultural theorists like Kay Wayne Yang discussed it from the perspective of decolonizing the university. More recently, there's been important articles by scholars like Sharon Stein and Margaret Nash, who have framed the Morrill Act of 1862 as settler colonial legislation that took from Indigenous nations to expand agricultural and mechanical education for settlers. And they started really to unpack how this legislation worked as a redistributive tool. Meanwhile, there were some researchers at places like UMass and Virginia Tech that had tried mapping the Morrill Act footprint, the geographic Morrill Act footprint of their individual schools, and to connect them to the Indigenous nations whose land was repurposed to create these endowments. But these investigations hit snags. None of them were completed. Then there were other schools like the Iowa State University, where I was speaking at virtually earlier this week, Michigan State University, the University of Nebraska, all land-grant colleges that were mapping their Morrill Act parcels, but not asking about the sources of the land, where it came from. And more work along these lines is currently on the way. So there has been really this emerging conversation about rethinking the origins of land-grant universities. So all of these sort of developments made it a really exciting time in 2018, really, when this project started, to ask these questions and to investigate what had been, up until that point, a almost entirely neglected issue in the scholarship and also in the public memory of land-grant universities. And the collaborative project Land Grab Universities that was done through High Country News. Our contribution to this burgeoning field took off in 2018. I was a postdoc at the time at Harvard, and I was giving a talk on these issues and showing some of the preliminary research for this project. And afterwards, I got to talking to Tristan Atone, who was interested in working on this as well. And we built a collaboration to investigate this project, to conduct this investigation. And the goal of the project really was to try to unspool the Morrill Act, not completely. to not just identify the parcels that benefited a single university or were located in a single state or were taken from a particular indigenous nation, but to locate all of them, every single one of them, insofar as that was possible, to track down the origins of each one, to understand how they came into the possession of the United States and how they exited the United States possession into the possession of states and universities. And all of that was intentioned in order to try to gain a sense and a precise sense of the enormity of the wealth transfer that the Morrill Act entailed. And that's really at the core of the analysis here, thinking about laws like the Morrill Act, like the Homestead Act, like the Pacific Railway Act, as a wealth transfer from indigenous nations to settler institutions of the United States. Not just a donation from the federal government to these institutions, but a wealth transfer. And the map that you've been looking at for the past couple of minutes, this map of the United States with all these purple, all the purple parcels here, is the results of this investigation in its most condensed form. And I'll get into a little bit of what you're looking at here and what this map contains. But let me give you a little bit more sort of background on the Morrill Act and land grant colleges. I should say, first of all, that land grant colleges as a institutional funding mechanism, as a type of institution, did not start in 1862 with the Morrill Act. In the decades before, in the 1850s, you had individual land grant colleges being founded as sort of individual grants, places like Michigan State University, Pennsylvania State University. Before that, you had federal grants to individual colleges. One of the earliest ones by the United States is in 1803 to a now defunct college called Jefferson College, which was in Mississippi and was the alma mater of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. Before that, in the colonial period, you had individual colonies in what would later become the United States, the English colonies, redistributing land that had been expropriated from indigenous nations to colleges, places like Harvard, William and Mary. This starts as early as 1618, and it follows some models that were being pioneered really in the 1500s in Ireland with the creation of Trinity in Dublin. So this is a very old form of funding universities. They don't start in 1862. But what happens in 1862 is an unprecedented boost in the size of these grants that are being doled out. What you have is the nationalization of what had been a sort of ad hoc type of program and institutional form. It gets turned into this national program that involves a much larger amount of land that had ever been funneled into this purpose before. This area, the size of Denmark or so. Naturally, this attracted a huge amount of attention from historians over the last 160 years, right, since the Morrill Act. But the way that historians analyzed the Morrill Act was the buzzword was sort of it was democracy's colleges ? And the question that historians were asking was to what extent land grant universities fulfilled their mission of democratizing education in the United States, of opening up education and opportunities to the agricultural classes, to the industrial classes, to the poorer classes in the United States. And a lot of how historians looked at it was through that lens. They didn't ask about its relationship to the colonial development of the United States or the role of indigenous dispossession in the sort of material foundations of land grant universities. Another thing to know about the Morrill Act is that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. The sort of land grants for colleges are not they're not unique institutional beneficiaries or other types of beneficiaries. I mean, in 1862, when you have the Morrill Act, You also have the other two sort of landmark land laws of the 19th century, the Homestead Act of 1862 and the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. These are all passed during Lincoln's first term within months of each other, but they are three of thousands of land laws that are passed in the 19th century in the United States that are involved in one way or another in redirecting the spoils of territorial expansion into the hands of settlers, institutions, states in order to subsidize the development of the United States in the 19th century. So just a reminder again where the Morrill Act fits into this, it's going to give away 10.8 million acres to 47 states, which are going to sell this land, they're going to lease this land, and they're going to funnel the proceeds into endowments for what become 52 universities. Most states will provide the endowment to a single university. There's a handful of them that will give them to 2 universities at most. These are mostly public universities, places like the University of Nebraska or the University of Wisconsin. There are also some private universities, MIT, Cornell, Brown and Yale. Ivy League colleges were early beneficiaries of the Morrill Act as well. It involved the land of nearly 250 different tribes and nations. And the land was claimed through 162 treaties. Most of these were ratified treaties. Many of them were unratified treaties, outright land seizures taken through congressional acts and through executive orders. And when you look at the details, it's sort of the big global picture, which is what we were after in this investigation. When you look at what was paid, it amounts to roughly $400,000 was paid through these various really coercive legal instruments that undervalued the land. About $400,000 was paid to extinguish Indian title. This is the term of art in the 19th century, to extinguish Indian title. And from that same land, that $400,000 was paid for to extinguish Indian title, nearly $23 million is raised. So the ratio is about 57 to 1. For every $1 that the United States spends on acquiring Indian title to land that's going to be used through the Morrill Act, it raises $57 off the same land. And in contemporary dollars, what we're talking about here is endowment principal across the program of about $500 million in today's money. And this is what you're looking at here in its condensed form. Here are the 80,000, roughly 80,000 parcels spread across 24 states, and the means to compare them, layering them over the indigenous land cession areas here that you see layered onto this map. So the pole lines can provide you with statistics about what's going on in different places in different times. Here in 1837, you see the Chippewa Treaty of 1837 contributing more than 1 million acres to 33 land grant universities in the Wisconsin area. This is land that raised $3.2 million, cost the United States less than $65,000 to acquire. This graphic here, this is one of the 2 of the graphics from the article we put out from this. It explains how the Morrill Act worked, the logistics of how the Morrill Act worked. You're not supposed to be able to read all the items here, but I'll tell you that there were 5 steps that you see on the top in how sort of the Morrill Act processed these grants. The first step was that Congress would offer the grants to the states. They had to accept them. The second point here is that some of this land had already been acquired from indigenous nations, and some of it would be acquired in the future through future treaties and takings. The third point here is about the size of the grants. These were not uniform in size. They ranged anywhere from 90,000 acres to 990,000 acres. And the difference was dependent on population, or more specifically, it was dependent on congressional delegation size, which is a proxy for population. So small states, less populous states would get 90,000 acres, and the most populous state was New York in 1860. They used the 1860 census to do these calculations. Was New York. Got 990,000 acres that would go towards the benefit of Cornell universities. The parcels that would make up these grants, they could range from anywhere from less than an acre to more than 800 acres. And the fourth point here is the one that's also illustrated on the bottom of the image here, is really one of the most important ones for understanding how this worked across the entire country. There were two main ways in which the land was redistributed. Eastern states, so places like New York, you see Cornell here on the right, these were states in which public domain land, so land that had been taken from indigenous nations, reclassified as public domain land, carved up, surveyed, and sold off or granted out to new owners, where that land had been basically used up. So there wasn't land in the eastern states to provide for these grants. So eastern states like New York, Cornell here, they got something called scrip, which was like a coupon to select land anywhere on the public domain. And these could be traded on secondary markets. And that's what would happen. So they would get scrip to select anywhere in the public domain. So that's why you see Cornell's grant would ultimately be scattered across 15, 16, 17 different states. It was different for Western states. You see here on the left, the University of California. These were so-called land states that still had plenty of public domain land left to select from. And these states were required to select the land from within their state boundaries. And they would generally set up real estate offices, send out officers to go and physically scope out what land was available and to select it. The University of California, for instance, for decades, it ran a real estate office where it was mortgaging out its Morrill Act land in order to build up its endowment. And that's the fifth point here. The disposal of the land. It's one thing to get the rights to select land, to get a hold of this land. It's another to turn it into cash for the endowments. So finally, these states had to dispose of the grants. Scrip states tended to sell off that scrip on secondary markets to speculators. And land states tended to move more slowly and to speculate themselves with the land here. So that's how the Morrill Act works, is a sort of a 3-minute sketch of how the sort of process of it works. And if you look on this next slide, you can see some of these parcels that we're talking about here. You know, these 80,000 parcels. Here's one of them in red. This is a square mile tract, a 640-acre tract that's located today in Tucson, Arizona, not far from the airport, as you can see here. This was land that was seized from the Apache in 1886, and it was resold, redistributed by the University of Arizona to raise money for University of Arizona's endowment. Nothing was paid for this land. There's maybe a quarter of the tracts, nothing was paid at all. It was simply seized. And this particular tract raised about $2,000 for the endowment for the University of Arizona. In the middle panel here, you can see sort of zooming in on this tract over satellite imagery. This is a football field, a baseball diamond, the highway running through here, tract housing. And when you get down onto the ground here, you can see, I mean, this is almost unbelievable, the Apache Tears Motel. I should say that this graphics work is the work of Margaret Pierce, who was a cartographer and graphic designer for the project. The photographs, this one and others that you'll see, were taken by Kaylin Goodluck, who was a photographer for the project. We sent him on a tour to visit many of these parcels so we could understand and figure out what was on the ground. But it was the research process that enabled us to really identify these parcels with high levels of accuracy, to map them precisely, accurate to the acre. And we were able to find over 99% of that 10.8 million acres through the process of this research. And what this approach allows you to do is to couple stories that have been kept apart, but are really intimately intertwined. So in the article, we tell the story of the Dakota Cession of 1851 and the subsequent Dakota War, out of which 98% of the University of Minnesota's land grant in Minnesota will come from. We can tell the stories of Brown and Yale University that received these windfalls before the endowment is moved to state universities in the late 19th century. We can tell the story about the 1.7 million acres of land seized during the California genocide that would go on to raise funds for 32 land grant universities across the United States. So the article, based on this research, gives you one view of how this whole process worked, but we collected much more data than we could cover in an article. So what we also did was we built this website. This is landgrabu.org. You can go and check it out. Now, if you like, you can pull it up and you can play with the interactive maps on this site. What we wanted to do was to make, we wanted to make all the data available and accessible to a non-tech friendly audience. So you could sort of peruse it online at your leisure to get a sense of the full picture of this project, the first full scope of the Morrill Act, its full geographic footprint. And I'll just show you a little video of the types of things that are on the site. So here's one of the university's pages. There's a university page for every university that was a beneficiary. This is Cornell's page. Here we are in Ithaca, New York, the location of Cornell. You can zoom out and you see these red lines turning blue, almost like scattering like a firework here, connecting to all of the individual parcels that Cornell University benefited from. Nearly 1 million acres. We found 99% of these, and we're able to map them precisely. You can move around, you can turn on and off the parcels, you can turn on and off the Indigenous land sessions, you can drill down, look at statistics connected to each one of these parcels. So what we're doing here is we're showing the connections between the universities, the land, and the Indigenous nations. Here we are in the Great Valley of California, where Cornell, which is a New York university, benefits from nearly 250,000 acres in redeemed scrip here across the Great Valley of California. You can fly through here. You can locate there's a button on here. You can locate yourself. I mean, that's not going to work so well if you're based in the UK, but if you are living in the United States or watching from the United States, you can see if you are living on one of these parcels. And in fact, one of the collaborators on this project, Jeff McGee, who along with Cody Leff helped develop the website here, he discovered in the process of making this that he lived on one of these tracks in Seattle, which is a very expensive real estate market today. So you can check addresses. There's just tons of material to play with here, to explore, to construct your own narrative, to link universities to land sessions, to the Indigenous nations who are affected. And you'll see other materials on here, statements from all the universities involved, all the summary statistics, the headline statistics connected to each one of these grants. This is the University of Minnesota's grant. You can see it has that sort of firework effect. This is the 98% of of their grant that is located within the Dakota Cession of 1851. You can see it outlined here. Using these tools is what enables us this project to be so precise at such a massive scale. These are tools that really weren't available in a user-friendly way to historians, even 10 years ago, and not at all if you go back 30 years or so. So they're really enabling us to ask new questions and new and revealing questions. Here's the University of California's grant. How it looks scattered across all of California. You can look at this sort of zoomed out level, but you can also zoom in. And what's really, I think, important about this resource is that you can look at each one of these parcels individually. What Cody Leff and Jeff McGee, who built the website, what they've essentially done here is made a website with 80,000 individual web pages, one for each of these tracks that you can click on and look at all of the summary statistics and start to tell really a story about what was going on in a particular place. Here's that track that we were just looking at in California, details about when it went to the University of California, how much it raised. This is a tract that was taken during the California genocide through an unratified treaty with the Buena Vista and 6 or 7 other nations that you can see listed here. The returns on it are incalculable because nothing was paid for this land. It was simply seized, and this parcel raised about $786 for the University of California. Now, it's one thing to sort of look at these statistics in this way, but what this really enables you to do is to get down on the ground, and that's how we can figure out that this particular parcel today, where it stands in Los Angeles, atop it is the Directors Guild of America. There are other tracks that have well-known places around, for instance, Lake Tahoe in California. The Summer Olympics in 2028 is going to be held on one of these Morrill Act tracks, unbeknownst, I'm sure, to the organizers. But what these tools enable you to do is to discover those stories, those individual stories about these pieces of land and how they built what the United States is today. And these images, these are all images that were taken by Caitlin Goodluck during his tour. This is a private residence in Los Angeles that was taken by unratified treaty in 1851, granted to the state of California for the benefit of the University of California. We know that no money was paid for title to this tract, and that the university also raised about $800 off of this one. Here is the Fort Lawton Post Cemetery in Seattle, Washington. We know that the Duwamish and the Suquamish ceded this land by treaty in 1855. That was granted to South Carolina for the benefit of South Carolina State University and Clemson University. About $3.91 was paid for this tract, and it raised about $58 for the universities. Now, despite signing that treaty in 1855, today the Duwamish and Suquamish are not recognized. They're not federally recognized as a nation. Here are the cornfields from the title slide. This is in Adams County, Nebraska, taken from the Kansa Nation in 1825. They were granted for the benefit of Ohio State University. Here's one of those Minnesota tracts that benefited the University of Minnesota from the 1851 Dakota Treaty. You can see what's there today, a junkyard here in El Rosa, Minnesota. And you can really get a sense for what was happening on the ground by using the tools of the project to physically, locate yourself in space and to understand these as real spaces where people really live today. And there's a hidden history behind it that we can access in this way. Now, the research for this project also turned up very unexpected things, and probably the most unexpected thing that it turned up is embodied in this chart here, which was outlined in a follow-up article, and that is the fact that not all of this land, not all of the Morrill Act land has been sold or disposed of. About 500,000 acres are still retained by the states for the benefit of 16 land grant universities. So about 500,000 acres. And in fiscal year 2019, this land raised nearly $9 million for these universities. We still do not know what the long-term income was from the Morrill Act lands. So there's still a ton of research to be done on this issue to really understand how it transformed the land grant university system in the United States. And a really important part of this project was advancing that body of research. This was an open source project. We have made all of the data that we collected publicly available. This is the GitHub page. You can find it through the landgrabu.org website. You can download all the data that we found. So, in thinking about sort of the conceptual universe of the project, there are really sort of 3 levels of curation that you get. There is the articles that provide the highest level of curation. They really guide you through what the Morrill Act was, how it worked, and how these methods can enable us to tell new stories about institutions that we thought we fully understood. Then there's the website. That is a lower level of curation, sort of allows you to explore at will, sort of choose your own adventure through the data. Now, then there's this 3rd level, which you see here, which is the data itself, which really allows you to dig into it and to find things that we didn't think to look for. These, as a historian, these were very important for me to provide. They are the equivalent of footnotes. You know, there are 80,000 footnotes for this project for each one of these parcels to try and understand where we got the information from. This is just the GitHub page. We also have, in plain English, a guide on how to use the data sets, you know, exactly what it all contains. We also have, I mean, this is what it looks like when you open it up on your desktop. If you use something like Excel, you can use this data. There's a lot of it, but it's very accessible, and it's not terribly complicated to use. And we've been really excited to see people using the data in the 2 years, nearly 2 years since this was published. This is what's behind the data. Images like this, material that had to be transcribed and turned into digital data and made accessible. This is some financial data, but this is people using the data. This is Ione, Ohio. They took the database and they mapped all of Ohio's parcels for a story. Fox. They took some of the data and they created a timeline to dig into what was going on with the University of Missouri and its relationship to the Osage people. This is a project by Scalawag, which took the methodology that I developed for this project and used it to look at the University of North Carolina, which was not a land grant university under the Morrill Act, but was one of those earlier land grant universities. And they found Chickasaw land was funding their early operations in the first half of the 19th century at very, very high levels. We've also seen reactions from students. On the left is a resolution from the University of Florida Student Senate. On the right, reactions from students at Cornell who have started to call for action and investigation to try and understand how this phenomenon shaped their universities. Washington State University changed its land acknowledgement. Now, many of you might have seen land acknowledgements or heard them at conferences where institutions will acknowledge the indigenous land on which they're built. Part of the argument of this project is that land-grant universities were not just built on indigenous land, they were built with indigenous land. It was capitalized. And we've seen Washington State University change its land grant, its land acknowledgement to reflect its connections to the Morrill Act as a key source of funding. We've seen conferences organized at the University of California. They organized a conference based off this research to look deeper into California's a relationship to the Morrill Act. They recently put out a 70-page report detailing their findings, which is really exciting to see. Several universities have organized investigative projects like Cornell. This is the Cornell University and Indigenous Dispossession Project, which is now digging in and trying to understand Cornell's relationship, its dependence on Morrill Act funds, and its connections to Indigenous people, particularly in places like Wisconsin, where much of their land was located. Ohio State did something similar. They have teamed up with the First Nations Development Institute and are trying to think of ways to rethink their land grant legacy and redirect funds in a way that will benefit Indigenous students at their university. Those are just a few of the things that have resulted from this research over the past couple of years. I mean, we're still in the phase where people are sort of talking about these issues and less on the side of action, but I think that's where it's heading. Yeah, that is land grab universities.
Wow, thank you, Bobby. What an incredible piece of research you have done here. It's almost mind-boggling, especially with what seems like a relatively small research team.